say thank you to Shane and to Terra Madre for inviting me. This is really an honor. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about some strange times we live in. I've just come off a conference call with colleagues in Colombia who are really suffering. I mean, you know, food supply chains have broken down. So I'm going to challenge some of those things. I'm going to put them into context, and I'm going to hopefully we will have a debate. Happens. Okay, so here's the slides. I've got a lot of slides and I will flick through them. You can download them later, so don't worry if I go through some of them pretty fast. You can pick them up later and look at the details. So that's, Shane's already introduced me, and the title is Food at What Cost, and I've added and for who. The cost for who is a big issue, because I think within the food supply chain we are actually seeing, because of COVID, more inequalities emerging. So I'm going to start with the basis to my talk, which is hunger. I mean, I think hunger is a major crime. And here we have Tom Morello, who's a musician, talking about hunger is a crime, and a Lebanese activist and composer saying, I'm not a heathen, but hunger is a heathen. I think what we're seeing at the moment is more and more hunger across the globe. WHO and the UN are saying we're now seeing absolute slides into absolute poverty. In the UK, we just found that 60% of those on low income went hungry in the last 3 months and ate less food because they could not afford it. So this is the context, and this is the background to what I want to get across. So I think hunger is unacceptable and unnecessary. It's not about a lack of food. It's about millions of people living permanently on the cusp of hunger because of the way the food system is structured. It's not that there's not enough food per se. I mean, the distribution of that food and access to that food are problems. And what we're seeing at the moment is trade restrictions in some areas, making it more problematic. FAO estimates, the Food and Agricultural Organization, that there were pre-COVID over 17 million people in crisis in Africa. Currently, what we're looking at is that number going up to 22, 23 million because of a lack of rainfall and barriers to food imports and exports between countries. And of course, COVID-19 is exacerbating that. It's making it worse for people, partially because of the transport, partially because some of the food can't get from one area to another. And people who are growing cash crops, for those of us in the rich north, are facing barriers to getting their products to us in the rich north. So these are the models, the food system. We think about, we'd like to have something like this. If it's something about retailing, even if it's supermarkets, we'd like something from crate to plate. Unfortunately, I think it's much more complex than that. This is an example from Europe. This just shows buying desks in Europe. This is the farmers and workers, 3 million farmers and workers in Europe. 160 million consumers, but power is concentrated here, largely in supermarket buying desks. 110 supermarket buying desks control the price of food. And of course, what they do is they squeeze this grouping down here and charge us more up here, so profits go back to the supermarket. So there's a block in the food system. Now, this is another model, sorry, it's a bit unclear. This is another model of the food system, but one of the problems that's happening with the food system is the commodification and financialization of food. The 2008 Great Recession, food prices increased by 20%. So the commodity market and the traders market are now using food as a futures, which is a bit like gambling. They're buying the rights to food in the future and hedging bets and selling it on the market and trading it before it's even grown. Now, there are some advantages to that, and I want to come back to that at the very end, but the commodification of financialization of food is becoming a major problem for growers, particularly in the global south. So recently, just the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems said, they asked these four questions. Do consumers have access to goods? Foods are physically accessible, but are they available? And do consumers have enough purchasing power to buy goods? Do exporters have access to goods? Can they get the goods that are grown, say, inland in Ghana? Do retailers and caterers have access to the food? And do producers have access to labour forces? We're seeing lots of problems with migrant labour. Sometimes COVID is used as an excuse for political aims to stop migration of labour. UK, US, China to some extent, and we're seeing it in South America. Now, I think a problem with this slide and what the question the panel of experts are asking is it's based around consumers. It's not based around citizens. And what rights do citizens have to food? And we need to I think we need to turn this argument on its head and talk more about citizens and the right to food rather than just consumers. The consumer model. I mean, even when there is famine, there is usually food, and people have access to that food as consumers if they've got money. But if they don't have money, they don't have access to that food. So Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize laureate, talked about this in his book, Food and Poverty, Poverty and Food. So next slide. So it's currently, unfortunately, business as usual. 20 million, including 12 million children in West and Southern Africa will be acutely malnourished in the lean season from June to August, linked to COVID-19. It's due to some of the reasons I've just said. Much of this will be among the urban poor, but rural areas will have been impacted. And we don't have direct figures on that because it's really hard to collect data on rural areas. And transport and storage become more pressing issues. I mean, goods produced in Africa, the loss is usually through inadequate storage and transport. And if there are even more delays to that, we're going to see more loss of that product. Okay, the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, which many of us didn't think is not actually over. We're seeing, re-emergence of that with COVID. But what happened was, I put up Bruce Springsteen here. I'm a fan, but what he's arguing for the New Jersey Food Bank. And the point about this is when the crisis happened, what we'd done was we bailed out the banks, the financial sector. But concomitantly, we saw an increase in food banks globally. I mean, we saw it everywhere. We saw it in the UK, we saw it in the US, we saw it in Canada, who are already well established with food banks. And what's happening globally is there's less global governance. I mean, think about the US withdrawing from the UN, the impact on WHO of all of that. And globally, what we're seeing is an increase in philanthropy, with private philanthropy now outstripping the budgets of UN agencies. Now, it's great that people are giving money to that, but we need UN agencies to be monitoring and tracking what's going on and offering solutions. And what we're seeing, I think, with a lot of this philanthropy is a lot of talk and a little action on food justice and the environment. A lot of the money comes from the Gates Foundation, and Warren Buffett has just amalgamated his trust into the Gates Foundation. We're seeing high-tech solutions, when with food we actually need low-tech solutions, some low-tech solutions and access to food. So I'm going to use two examples. I'm going to use coffee and cocoa, both cash crops. And I mean, generally, I'm just going to make this as a background point that climate, I mean, there are more general issues which exacerbate problems with both cocoa and coffee: climate, zoonosis and pests, decreasing consumer demand. So an increase for demand in hogs in China due to the economy and feedstuffs is happening at the moment. A decrease in coffee because the hospitality sector has been shut down. So what do we do with coffee? Trade wars and financialization and commodification of food. We're seeing trade wars going on at the moment. Brexit is one example, but the US is entering into trade wars with China, often using food as an excuse to ban other things. So some of the stuff around Hawaii and the high-tech stuff is food is being used as a barrier for trade. The problems with labor and migrant flows is common to most products we think of across the globe. So now I'm going to go into specific examples of coffee and cocoa. So cocoa, restricted growing in the tropics. I'm going to flick through this. The majority of processing is completed in consuming countries, about 60 to 70%, where the added value occurs. Now, this is classic of most products. You take it away from the area it's growing, you process it, and you add value. So little footprint remains where it's being produced. So if you think the Côte d'Ivory from 2016, the Gold Coast from 2016 onwards was vying with the Netherlands for the title of the largest processing country. But 86% of processing in Côte d'Ivory was controlled by multinational companies. So the footfall, what's left behind is not very much. There's a lack of investment generally in producing countries. So with cocoa, sorry, this is just a map. 60 to 70% of the world's supply is grown here in West Africa. Yet they get very little in return for that. I'll show you the figures in a moment. This is the consumption pattern. This is the bigger the block of chocolate, that's where it's consumed. Of course, China and Southeast Asia are major growth areas for chocolate. But the consumption of chocolate in Africa itself is very low. This is a cash crop, which is mainly exported. So for cocoa, control is vested in the big five globally: Mars, Hershey, Nestle, Mondelez, and Ferraro. And Mondelez includes Cadbury, for those of you in the UK. And three global processors. Now this is not unusual. As you go up, or depending which way you look at the food chain, as you go up the food chain, you get concentrations, whether it's supermarkets or people processing cocoa. So the big five, the big three, and now commodities and future markets. There's a lot of commodification and selling of the future rights to cocoa. Yet Ghana, as I said, Ghana and the Côte d'Ivory account for 70% of global supply and have very little say in the setting of prices. I mean, their production levels are incredibly high, but they don't get the benefit, or they don't actually, they're not even allowed to negotiate. Sorry, something's happened to my slides. Let me just get back. So this is what it looks like. This is Oxfam data. 3% stays with the farmer of the price of a bar of chocolate in the supermarket. Something like 5% goes on local, so it's about 8% stays in the country of origin. 12% transport and storage. Again, some of that will stay, but some of it will go out. But 43% is in the retail and supermarket margin. I mean, we've got to cut this down and give more to people, the growers up here, because what's happening is people are leaving cocoa growing because they can't make a living. At 3%, the farmer is saying, I'll go and grow something else. Now, coffee. I'm passionate about coffee, and this is the food chain for coffee. You know, it's complicated. I mean, the COVID crisis has driven this further into crisis because of the shutdown of hospitality. I mean, hospitality accounted for a large proportion of coffee consumption. That's been shut down. The chain has had to adapt. So even they've had to think about how you process it, how you get it into smaller bags to the consumer, and there is more home consumption, but it's not made up for the amount that was previously consumed through hospitality and catering. And globally, again, it's like cocoa. The coffee chain is worth $200 billion, but only 20 billion remains in producing countries. I mean, this is, you know, the footfall. The benefit to the producing countries is small. 80% of the world's coffee is produced by 25 million small farmers on farms of less than 10 hectares. Now, the big countries, the big producers like Brazil, are amalgamating small farms. It's more likely to be processed and less manual labor in places like Brazil. But the workforce is largely a small family-based workforce, of 75% of whom are women, but often not accounted for in financial terms. So money doesn't flow back to women, even though they're involved in the work and the processing of coffee. Now, the way companies tackle that is they set up social responsibility projects, which divert money back to local communities. And that's one way of doing it. But it's not giving people necessarily a fair price for the product. It's charity in one sense. It's philanthropy. And producers are susceptible, coffee producers are susceptible to economic hardships caused by fluctuation in the global coffee price. And this is called the C price, climate change, and local social political upheavals. I mean, think about what happens in Colombia or some of the South American countries where we get a large amount of our coffee from. The social political upheavals in Colombia over terrorism interrupted coffee supplies. We suffer, you know, we think, oh, we didn't get our coffee this month. Well, I like my Colombian coffee, it hasn't arrived. But actually the farmer in Colombia is the one who suffers at the end of the day. Similar to the cocoa trade, the coffee trade is controlled by two sets of actors, roasters and traders, and they're both highly concentrated. Nestle is the #1 global roaster, but it's currently been challenged by supremacy by a German investment firm, JAB Coffee, who just spent 350 billion last year acquiring coffee chains and restaurant chains that sell large amounts of coffee. Now this in the business world is called mergers and acquisitions. You won't see JAB on the front of a coffee shop in Indonesia. They will keep the local name, but they will control it in the background. Recently, last year, Coca-Cola acquired Costa Coffee as it sees the future of coffee or caffeine-containing drinks is important, and this gives it a high street presence. Of course, COVID has put all that into question at the moment, but it's quite likely we will see a re-emergence, not of city centre, but of urban areas with coffee presence. I mean, the fringes of cities where people live are more likely. We're seeing growth already in suburban areas of coffee shops, whereas city centres, it'll be hard for them to recover, I think, in the long term. And the largest global coffee trader is Newman Cafe Group with 10% of global green trading. This is equivalent, just to give you a sense of the power of this, that's equivalent to the total coffee output of Colombia. Many of the major trading companies here in the coffee area are privately owned. They're not public, they don't have to account for public presence and have board meetings with investors. I mean, they're still largely privately owned. I have to say, in fairness to them, a lot of them have corporate social responsibility outputs with charities which feed back into the system, because they're all worried, both cocoa and coffee, about the future of coffee production. So if you think about just coffee again for the moment, about 20% remains with the producer, the grower. International traders, 8%, and this is growing. The commodification, we think we'll see this go up to 17, 18%. This is people trading coffee who don't actually sell the coffee at the end of the day or don't process it. They just sell it on to traders and onto the roasters and sometimes the retailers. Okay, I think I can, but this is just showing some data from Colombia. And as I said, I'm doing some work in Colombia, and I am interested in coffee personally. But it just shows business as usual. They asked people, what were the major problems you were facing? In Colombia, it was lack of labor. This is migrant flows, partially due to the migrant flows through Colombia with people on their way to South America. There's been a shutdown of skilled migrant labor, so they're having problems. Sorry, this is Colombia, this is Ecuador, and this is Peru. Peru, something the same, it's skilled labor. And this is about skilled labor, not just labor, because picking coffee is backbreaking, but it is a skilled labor. A lack of money was more apparent in Ecuador, just not having enough income. Roads closed, less of a problem in Colombia, small problem in Peru, but a huge problem in Ecuador. And this is, again, due to lack of infrastructure. If private companies don't invest in local infrastructure and roads. I mean, governments need to have income to invest in roads so people can get coffee or cocoa out of the rural areas to the export areas, to the ports and into the containers. So this is a summary of what's happened with the impact of COVID on the value chain of coffee. Okay, so farmers, shortage of manpower, postponement of order requests. People are saying, no, I don't need 10 tons, I only need 6 tons. Monetary devaluations, so depending on how the dollar goes and indeed how oil is trading, closure of small operations and destruction of local economies. Exporters are reporting shortages of staff, fewer shipments and less container space because other products are being shipped over and above coffee. And investment for personal safety and disinfection around COVID is, there's lack of investment. I mean, this is a major problem. Coffee roasters, temporary closure of production, delays, blocking of deliveries, accumulation of stocks. I mean, there is now, in a sense, despite the postponement of order requests, an accumulation of stocks because of the hospitality shutdown. Some of my local pubs had bags of coffee. I mean, but they were in big, you know, whatever, 30-kilo bags. And they had to break them up and sell them in smaller amounts because they weren't selling them in the normal way in the hospitality sector. I mean, there's a coffee roaster closure for small operators linked to away from home. I think my feeling is coffee roasters will probably survive. It's such a specialty market, and the margins are quite high for specialty roasters. Bars and restaurant, business closures, takeaways, home delivery, lack of, I mean, these are the usual things. Everybody's facing this at the moment. Adjustment measures. I mean, you know, what happens, the 10 o'clock curfew, can people meet in groups of 5 or 6? All of these things of reduction of space and customers. They're not using their space to the maximum benefit, and they're still paying quite high rents. And consumers, collapse of consumption outside the home, slight increase in consumption at home, an increase in online orders, but not enough to make up for this, for the intake of coffee that would normally happen here. Consumers, possible reduction of disposable income. You know, the next 6 months in COVID will tell us what happens. We don't know, but incomes are likely to go down. I mean, of course, there are, I'm not really dealing in any great detail with environment and livelihood concerns, but I just want to acknowledge them. For environment, with coffee, Brazil, India, and Uganda, who are major producers, are predicted to lose greater than 60%, sorry, there's a typo there, more than 60% of their suitable coffee growing areas by 2050. Partially due to environment, partially due to livelihood issues because of people leaving the land. Colombia and Ethiopia are, another typo, losing up to 30% of land fit for coffee cultivation. And the roasters and the traders are really worried about this. Hence, they are investing back into the system, mainly through philanthropy and charity, but they are reinvesting, they're setting up training programs. I want to come back to that later and say, why aren't government and global agencies doing that? Climate change is clearly going to have an impact on both cocoa and coffee production. It is already having impacts on coffee production, with people having to move up higher into the mountains, which means they then have further problems with transport. Tensions over global north versus global and south concepts of environmental stewardship. I mean, we in the global north think, oh, they should be looking after their land much better. And you know, what's happening in the Amazon is disastrous. But for cocoa, for example, there's a thing called the forest rent. So people plant cocoa in the forest. Now, the ownership of that land is debatable. It's probably not owned by the planter, but it's free and they move on from year to year. Now, this is probably sustainable, but we're not measuring it, and there's a sort of feeling, oh, this isn't quite right, but it's an established practice, particularly in Africa, this thing called forest rent. Crop diseases clearly are an issue, and potable water. You know, what we're asking people to do in the global south is use water which they should be using for their own purposes to clean goods for us in the global north. Livelihoods, okay, a lack of income, Slave labor is still the modern slavery issue with cocoa, children being, picking cocoa, which is backbreaking, and not going to school. Now, I mean, there's a middle line between allowing kids to work, but allowing them to have education. I mean, it's a balance. If you have family labor, it's probably inevitable, but it does need some control. And I mean, in Ghana, they're particularly anxious about this, so they're paying a premium to local producers to keep kids in school. Skilled migrant labor is a question. The migration of skilled migrant labor, even within countries, is now a problem. Never mind between countries. Land ownership, subtenanting, particularly in Africa, but also in South America, is a problem. So a farmer takes his 10 hectares, splits it in two between his two sons, and what used to be called conacre, it gets smaller and smaller until it's no longer sustainable for people to make a living off that land. And people moving to other cash crops in cities. So sometimes the cash crops could be drugs. So I'm not getting enough from cocoa, so I'm going to go cocaine. You've got to understand the principle of why people do that. So I'm back to food poverty. This is the hunger pandemic. This is just a picture of how it pans out with COVID. And the bigger the circles, the bigger the problem. So look, I mean, it's largely Africa, but quite a lot of Southeast Asia. I mean, I will come back and say there is poverty up here, and we are seeing the reemergence of hunger even in the global north. I'm really, really concerned about this in areas like the UK. And if you think about food spend, in some countries of the global north, the UK specifically, I mean, it's 8.7%, but we estimated at about 11%. We spend very little on food, as opposed to someone in Nigeria spends 56% of their income on food. Now, the problem with this is cheap food. And the producer down here is not getting paid really for their labor. They're not getting a pro rata income. Governments keep this low because of GDP, because if we can keep food prices low, traditionally we use gross domestic product as an indicator of prosperity. COVID is calling that into question, of course, but it's still used. We should be talking about a happiness and wellness index. But by keeping food prices low, it allows people to spend money on other goods, housing, cars, white goods such as televisions, and that keeps GDP up. So governments have a vested interest in keeping food prices low. Now, this is an example from the UK. I mean, we've just, as I said in my introduction, we've just had data showing 60% of those on low income have gone hungry and have gone without a meal in the last couple of weeks. Pre-COVID, this was the estimated number of households fed by the Trussell Trust, something like 60, 70,000. But we knew the numbers of food insecure were something like 17 times higher than that. Because if you're only measuring currently who's food insecure, you're not measuring those who are at risk of food insecure. And what COVID has done is exposed those who are at risk, those who are on one income away from pecuniary, one income away from not having a meal next week because they're in the gig economy, their jobs have dried up, they have very few savings, they were maxed out on their credit cards. A number of the credit card companies in the first weeks of the COVID crisis here in the UK shut down access to credit for people on low incomes. So they couldn't access food through things like online ordering. They had nothing to fall back on. So what we saw in the first 5-6 weeks of the COVID crisis was this number increased by fivefold as people access food banks. And we think it will get worse in the next 6 months. I think, ironically, if you think about the crisis, the root of the crisis of obesity and food poverty or food insecurity are the same. It's lack of income and inequality. Yet we don't treat them. We treat them separately. We treat obesity. Obesity is the new marker of poverty. and that does, people who are hungry can also be obese. I mean, it swings and roundabouts at different times of the month. So food poverty and obesity, we need to think as part of the one problem, not as separate problems. So I'm coming to an end now. I'm coming to solutions. So what would we like? I mean, I'm sure most of you listening here, we'd like something like a closed loop system. And I think that's fine. And I think the next 5 to 7 years, we will see closed loop systems. But I think who controls them, we have to be concerned about. I think the major supermarkets will control closed loop systems in the next 5 to 10 years. Because they already are thinking this way. They've seen this crisis. They're moving back to systems, but they're not alerting consumers to that at the moment because they don't want to worry consumers. They just want to have goods on the shelves. So I think we have to just not argue for closed loop systems, but argue for regulation of closed loop systems. And this can happen at different node points from national to global and horizontally across regions, as in an EU, or across trading blocks, as in NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Organization, which is also in doubt because of Trump's administration. I'm coming back to this thing about subprime, about financing and commodification. This is a heading from the FT recently. They're saying that the next subprime crisis, which is the equivalent of the banking crisis of 2007 and 2008, will be seen in food as traders invest more in food commodities and trade them on markets, that there's a danger of collapse of that whole system. Now, there is a thing called the Tobin food tax, which is we put a 1% charge on all trade that doesn't actually involve real food, it's just trade, and we could fund UN agencies through that. I think we've got to, I'm not completely against commodification and futures trading. I see some benefits. A farmer in Africa or a farmer growing coffee in Colombia is guaranteed the price for next year, so they know what they're getting and they can plan accordingly. But it's the introduction of what are called parasitic traders, people coming into the market who don't understand food and are just trading this in order to make a profit. It's a bit like gambling. So I think there is a place for futures. Again, I mean, we've seen this with sugar. It's funny, I've picked 3 products which are not necessarily good for, not necessarily for health. I mean, they're sugar, and lots of public health agencies have problems with sugar. But it's this issue of parasitic traders. So the risks are that global governance is under threat. The WHO, you know, the Trump administration pulling out funding for WHO, UN agencies, Brexit here in the UK, NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico and the US is in serious doubt. National governance is insufficient in the light of globalization, probably. Trade barriers and using issues such as COVID-19, politics and zoonosis, they hinder trade. So the China-US wars, food has become a casualty. Hog meat is the latest example, and feed for animals. There's blocks on going both ways because of wider trade issues. Zoonosis is going to be a major problem in the next 10 years. And existing preferred tariff-free relationships are in jeopardy, and there are a number. The US has agreements where African countries which meet its Growth and Opportunity Act and the EU schemes have currently recognized about 44 countries. There are no tariffs coming in on goods from those countries. These are in serious jeopardy, which has a major impact on people in those countries. So what do we need to do? We need to lobby. We need to use networks such as FIAN, the Milano Accord, WCRF, Terra, Madre, the Campesina movements to build communities of practice and give voice to those at the production ends of the food chain. Those voices are not being heard. We need to link activities in seemingly different areas of endeavor. I mean, sometimes your enemy in one area can be your ally in another area. So if you think of GM foods, actually supermarkets here in the UK have been against GM foods, so I might argue a lot against supermarkets, but in the area of GM foods, because of consumer demand, I suddenly find they're an ally in that area. We need to provide examples of economies which are health enhancing, human and environmental, and there are some out there. We need to challenge the power of big food, whether that be the supermarkets, the big cocoa producers, the manufacturers, or coffee manufacturers. We need to change practice and think globally while acting locally, I suppose, and think and articulate what sort of food system we want. I mean, we're not very good at articulating the food system we want. We need to mainstream it, and we need to start from where we are and not establish a system for the few with the capital assets and social assets who can afford it. You know, I can live off grid because I can afford it, but other people don't have those capital assets to do that. We need to look at hunger and food insecurity, and we need to re-establish and hold governments to the right to food for the citizens. I think that's not some highfalutin notion. I think we actually need to take governments to court over this issue. Okay, I think I'm finished. I think you can read the rest at your own leisure. I'm happy to take questions, and I'm going to stop screen sharing and take us back to video.
Yes, so Martin, thank you very much for that. It was absolutely fascinating. If anyone has any questions for Martin, put it in the question and answer box and I will ask the questions. But I just thought it was absolutely extraordinary, Martin. I was just really fascinated that 110 supermarket buyers are controlling the price of the food, keeping a largely female workforce in developing countries in poverty, and even driving things like, you know, the production of cocaine. Simply because it's more profitable to grow cocaine or grow the coca plant for cocaine than it is coffee or chocolate. So the actions of, you know, decisions being made here in the West, you know, really have the most incredible effect. I'm just seeing if we've got any questions. People are being a little bit shy for questions perhaps in this session, but do ask things. But Martin, what one thing could we perhaps do, watching now, listening now? I know that's a really tough question to ask, but is there one thing that we could do as citizens, as consumers, living here in the UK to somehow try and make this a little bit better?
Oh, I think we could, I mean, if we think about starting from where we are, we could make the current providers more accountable. I mean, in terms of local, I mean, or regional foods, I think every time you go into a supermarket, you should be asking, where does this food come from? Looking, I mean, I do think it's a disgrace at the height of our, some of our seasons, where it's not a question of saying Peru shouldn't give us goods, but at the height of our growing season, we have goods from Peru while we're growing those same goods. I mean, this makes no sense at all. So I think we should hold government to account. I think we should lobby our MPs. At the moment in the UK, if you ask specifically about the UK, you know, the farm bill's going through, and I mean, we're about to see bilateral trade agreements between here and the US and other countries. So we might have things like chlorinated chicken. I think Sustain have launched a campaign, lobby your MP. I mean, we need to have voices to be heard around this. I think it's really important. We will become a dumping ground potentially for lots of US products.
We've got two questions at this time, and I'll give you both of them. From Sarah Saunders, if supermarkets are making hugely increased profits at the moment because of COVID, how can we target them? What's the most effective way of getting them to take these issues on board? And we also have a question from David, and that's in relation to the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to the UN's World Food Programme. What are your thoughts on that? So question number one, how do we target supermarkets? They're making a lot of money at the moment. And secondly, what's your response to the UN Food Programme getting the Nobel Peace Prize? Okay,
the supermarkets, I mean, they're paying out. They've got tax, they've got rent rebates. They're paying out to their, I mean, it's just amazing. But they have had increased costs. I mean, in their defense, what I would say is government took no action around food, and the supermarkets took action. I mean, I'm not a fan of supermarkets, but I have to say in this instance, they were the ones who stepped up to the base. They were the ones who made decisions about how we access our food. They were the ones, after the initial shock, because none of the algorithms worked in the first couple of weeks, the food supply system went into meltdown, they've sorted it out. I mean, the argument might be, let's put the supermarkets in charge of government rather than government in charge of government. I mean, they've at least solved this. really disturbed about the lack of government response. How can we target them? We can make them more responsible. We can, I think we should make them aware in our power as consumers, because they're interested in us as consumers, that we're interested in closed loop systems, in regional foods, in less food miles, less carbon. You know, we should make them aware of that. They listen to that sort of thing.
Mm. And Nobel Peace Prize for the World Food.
I hadn't been aware of that. I'm sorry, I hadn't caught up with that. Well, here we have a UN agency that's in major crisis. I think they do great work, but it's crisis work. You know, the UN Food Programme is massively under-resourced. The US is pulling out of it, so it's going to face a major funding crisis. It is crisis-driven at the moment. It's had to stop doing preventive work, and I think we need to fund it and FAO to do more preventive work. Ironically, the World Bank are on top of this. Again, I'm defending my traditional enemies. The World Bank are actually aware of things and are talking about preventive policies around food. While UN agencies are suffering massive declines in income. It's like, I don't know it's a crazy world, but I welcome them getting the prize, but we need to fund them to do that work.
Yeah, super. Sarah and Ellie are asking very similar questions around supermarket regulation. How can we regulate supermarkets? Well,
we've got a number of problems with regulating supermarkets in the UK. And there is no statutory regulation. There's an adjudicator who can issue some fines and has issued fines, and that's fine. But we also have a lack of planning law around supermarkets. And supermarkets in the past have bought up building stock. I mean, Tesco at one stage were sitting on a load of empty buildings, which is why they went into crisis 2 or 3 years ago, because it looked on the books like they had a lot of money. They didn't. But one of the big things, we've seen a decline in pubs because supermarkets bought pubs, because pubs are the same classification as supermarkets. So they changed local pubs into supermarkets. And so the planning regulations around food are weak. Most planning doesn't even consider food. I mean, that's the problem. The big developers come in, set up shops, set up spaces, but the local planners don't have much power around food. They have some, and the current government have just relaxed planning regulation. So this is a major problem. I mean, we need to think, a new build, what's the size of supermarket? Do you need 3 small shops? Do you need 5 small shops? How many should be fruit and veg? We don't think of planning in that way around retail generally.
I just think this is astonishing. So we have supermarkets, as we said earlier, who are indirectly causing cocaine, but also shutting our British high street pubs. So it's pretty staggering. We've probably got time for just one last question, and this is coming from Jackie, and she's asking whether or not we can shift out of palm oil and be used for coffee and other products. I know that coffee is a mountainous plant.
Yeah.
Coffee is a very particular product, and actually tomorrow we are having a conversation around sustainability in plants, which will be touching on coffee. Coffee is really being affected by climate change. The problem with mountainous plants is with climate change, they keep going to the top of the mountain and there's summits and mountains. But are there other things that we could be growing where there are cash crops, which would be more useful? And that, I'm afraid, is going to be the last question that I'm asking tonight.
There are, but the question is, we've got to think about transferring that growing. Do we grow cash crops for people, or do they grow crops that are more indigenous and more local to the area and have a footfall in the area? I mean, the governments have encouraged cash crops for various reasons. And at one stage, UN and World Bank and people were recommending cash crops, sell it, buy, and then you buy your wheat on the global market at a cheaper price. I mean, so the whole system needs looking at. What do you want people to grow? It's not just what can grow there. Is there more? I once worked in Lesotho in South Africa, in the landlocked country in South Africa, and there was a massive investment in potatoes, huge investment in potatoes for selling to the UK. I mean, it just didn't work. I mean, and it wasn't necessarily a crop that local people used to any great extent. So it was just completely out of sync with everything. But the